the voice of Radio Free Kosovo, made possible by the Albanian League of Prizren. The violation of human rights of the 3 million Albanian Kosovars in Yugoslavia was so gross and blatant that it deserved to be told openly and in plain language. The facts speak for themselves, especially since the communist leaders of Yugoslavia seemed unaware of the fact that since 1944, they had squandered their moral credit by arbitrary rule and oppression, which cannot be attributed either to war sacrifices or to fear of outside interference. The present unsettled situation in the predominantly Albanian inhabited region of Kosovo, generating the vicious Serbo-Albanian conflict, is the consequence of the abortive SFR, or Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia's effort to maintain past political injustices intact, while presently modifying the phraseology of a subtly disguised colonialism. Since the initial 1877-1878 Serbo-Montenegrin massacres on Albanian lands, the dehumanizing propaganda was also marked by skillful calls for a Christian crusade against the infidels, the Turks or Muslims, the formerly Albanian lands of Leskovac, Kurshumli, Niš, Spuz, Nikšić, and Antavari being at that time predominantly Muslim. The persistent Serbo-Montenegrin national and religious hate, which brought about the aggression, had the effect of crystallizing the thought and consolidating the action of all Albanians who began to realize that Europe's identification of Albania with Turkey, based on religious grounds, spelled disaster for them. In 1878, the Albanian League of Prizren was founded to reorganize the resistance. Albanianism, born out of a faithful examination and reflection of the great issues of the nation's history, grew and became the mobilizing force. In literature, it was sung by the poet Pashko Vasa. The religion of the Albanians is Albanianism. For 30 years, Albanians were systematically harassed, attacked, and vilified by a dehumanizing propaganda, which lowered them to the level of pre-humans. The ground was prepared for the new massacres of the 1912-1913 Balkan Wars, when Albania lost more than half its territory to Serbia, Montenegro, and Greece. Kosta Novakovic, a Serbian officer and eyewitness, wrote, "The documentation exists that during 1912 alone, 12,777 Albanians were massacred by the newly arrived Serbo-Montenegrin armies." The historical rights of Serbia went even further. They wanted a Kosovo without Albanians. Kosovo is a purely Albanian region with 10 to 15% Serbian population, which settled there many centuries ago. How the conquering Serbo-Montenegrin armies conducted themselves in the newly invaded Albanian lands was described again by the Serbian socialist leader D. Tukovic. There were at the same time barbaric crematories in which hundreds of women and children were burned alive. Once again, it has been seen that a popular rebellion by the most primitive tribes is always more humane than the practices of a standing army, which a modern state uses to quell rebellion. A report of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace summed up the rationale of Serbia's horrors in Albania. Houses and whole villages reduced to ashes, unarmed and innocent populations massacred en masse, incredible acts of violence, pillage, brutality of every kind. Such were the means which were employed and are still being employed by the Serbo-Montenegrin soldiery, with a view to the entire transformation of the ethnic character of regions inhabited exclusively by Albanians. Villages, alerted by the waves of refugees, fled before the invaders who set fire to the abandoned cottages. The 1913 revolt by the local Albanians was drowned in blood. In Western Macedonia, where 500,000 Albanians live, police assessments were sufficient proof of sedition and the resultant executions. The seed of discord was thus sown, as the indigenous mixed population began to feel the effect of mutual distrust, a trend that most unfortunately was never reversed. Native Serbs saw that those Muslim Albanians who liked and helped them in Turkish times now showed far less goodwill. The Austro-Hungarian occupation of Kosovo, which followed the Serbian debacle of 1915, allowed the opening of 300 schools. and the use of the Albanian flag in spite of the fact that many Albanians, led by Azem Beta Galica, began an armed resistance against the invader. The freedom fighters were promised by Serbian authorities to open Albanian schools and several other rights, including the right to fly the Albanian flag. The return of the Serbian army in 1918 put an end to both Albanian schools, flags, and promises. Azem himself was chased as an outlaw until he died in 1924, exhausted by the rigors of a guerrilla warfare that for him began in 1913, although he had earned 2 medals from General Bachelet, the commander of the advancing French troops. Ivo Banic of Yale concluded that the Serbian occupations of Kosovo and Western Macedonia were as brutal as anything that had happened in 1912 and 1913. Nevertheless, European diplomacy decided to recognize the Serbo-Montenegrin military annexation of Kosovo, a new act of a tragedy, whose claws had mercilessly caught the Albanian Kosovars since 1877 had begun. A Serbian attempt to expand its domain by annexing northern Albania up the river Drini was unsuccessful, thanks to the resistance of the local Albanian population and the gallant intervention of the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson on March 6, 1920. The period between the two wars was characterized by policies of expulsion and assimilation, as Albanians continued to be treated as a subhuman species. Education in Albanian was strictly forbidden, and even education in Serbo-Croatian was very limited for Albanian children. The only concession made was the teaching of the Muslim religion in Turkish schools, a calculated move to denationalize and keep Albanians backward and ignorant. Unable to stem the growth of the local Albanian population, Belgrade directed its effort toward the expulsion of Albanians and their replacement with Serbo-Montenegrin settlements. Muslim Albanians, forced to register as Turks, emigrated by the thousands to Asia Minor, where poverty and diseases decimated them. What they owned was, according to local officials in Belgrade, below the minimum needed for survival. But that was precisely what we wanted, that is, to prevent them from living and therefore force them to emigrate." Closed quote. It is believed that over 600,000 Albanians reached Turkey by 1941. For those who remained, all forms of discrimination and persecution were applied to make their lives unbearable. Their lands were taken, their livestock sequestered, their taxes increased, and worst of all, they became free game for the local Yugoslav police and army units. Milovan Djilas reported the use of force and plunder was so open in Kosovo that it was hard to believe. One day the gendarme caught an Albanian, laid him across a felled tree, and beat him with the handle of his axe until his broken ribs penetrated his skin. And after he had revived a little, this man sat in front of his house and sunned himself, motionless, waiting out his slow death. The law was braced by the most notorious lot of carpetbagging chicaners in the whole of Yugoslavia. It was well known that all the scums that existed in the bureaucratic cadre who wanted to get rich quickly went as administrators to Sanjak, Kosovo, and Macedonia. The Albanian rebels, who did not submit to the regime, and they were in the thousands, took to the hills, where armed resistance had almost universal support. Politically, they were supported by the National Committee for the Defense of Kosovo, operating from Shkodër, Albania, until the return in 1925 of Amat Zagoli, later King Zog, who ordered its dispersal and persecuted its leaders, allegedly in line with a secret agreement with Belgrade. In Kosovo, the armed resistance, the Kakaks, suffered a mortal blow with the death of Azem Beta Galica on July 15, 1924. Open political representation was limited to a handful of Albanian representatives in the Belgrade Parliament, who fought courageously but without success, and were later assassinated by the Yugoslav gendarmerie. The collapse of monarchist Yugoslavia, April 1941, made it possible for the Albanian Kosovars to join with Albania, which had been occupied by Italy since 1939. Nevertheless, the emotional impact of the short experience which ended in November 1944 had left indelible marks on the minds and lives of the Albanian Kosovars. thousands of volunteers from Albania offered their services to their countrymen, this in Kosovo, setting up an Albanian local administration, opening Albanian schools, operating hospitals, building roads and bridges, organizing the local police and territorial units of self-defense, and so on. For the first time in their recent history, Albanian Kosovars were taking an active part in the affairs of a local administration that they felt was their own. Next time on the Voice of Radio Free Kosovo, a review of the last 40 years, from the fall of the Axis powers to the Tito years and beyond.